So if you want to put in the chat what your name is, the organization that you work for, your company, and maybe one word or a few words, whatever floats your boat, to describe your experience at the symposium thus far. Welcome, Erica. Welcome, Karen, Shara. I would agree with enlightened. That last presentation was incredible. All right. Because we have limited time, I'll get started, but as you feel the desire to, please feel free to put your information in the chat to get to know each other a little bit better, where you're coming from, how you're doing right now, maybe your expectations for the session. Anything is welcome. So you should be in the right place if you were intending to attend a session about tokenism. This session in particular is called Beyond Tokenism, Quotas Don't Automate Inclusion. A little bit about myself. My name is Natalia Rice. I am a proud Buffalo native. I am a certified DEIJ practitioner, and I currently serve as the Chief Equity Officer for New View Alliance in Buffalo. The main thing that really centers me in the work that I do is needing to transcend the performative. So when we do DEI, how do we do this work with intention? How do we go beyond check the box approaches to make sure that we're really working to realize long-term sustainable change and dismantling inequities and creating spaces of inclusion, belonging, and empowerment. And that's why, for me, tokenism was the topic that really spoke to me to want to present on today. So on our agenda, we're going to define tokenism, explore a little bit more what it is and what it isn't. I think that there are a lot of common misconceptions as this buzzword has become a little bit more present in our society, in our DEI work. So what is it? What isn't it? We will explore and understand the harm and implications of tokenism and token gestures. We will explore the why and how for prioritizing impact over percentages through the process of inclusive diversity. So shifting from tokenism to inclusive diversity in the work that we're doing. And we will identify opportunities to overcome check the box approaches, those performative efforts, in order to really do that real work to develop intentionally inclusive cultures. So I want to thank you all for being here today. I'm looking forward to this session. A few ground rules. First, I want to establish that this is not a lecture. There will be some content in here that's meant to be informative, but I want to encourage some interactive components. I want to encourage you all to use the chat. So if you have any questions that come up, if you have any ideas, anything that you'd like to expand on, any lived experiences that you would like to share, please feel free to do so. And I know that Ms. Karen Brown will be here to support in monitoring the chat. So as questions come up, anything is open here. And as I just said, any and all questions are welcome. This is not meant to be a lecture. I do this a lot. And so if there's something that you need me to slow down on, anything that you need clarification on, I'm open to it. Before diving into the actual content, I always find it to be incredibly important to establish a shared language around DEI, not because I don't think we don't know what it is, but so that you have a little bit more context about what I mean when I say, for example, diversity, when I say inclusion, when I refer to tokenism. So when we say diversity in this context, I'm talking about the wide range of identities, whether they be socio-demographic, somebody's personal identities, social identities. That could be race, ethnicity, gender identity, age, someone's sexual orientation, ability status, religious and spiritual affiliation, socioeconomic status, veteran status, the list goes on. So that wide range of identities in the room. And inclusion is making sure that when we have that diversity in the room, there is a provision of equal opportunity and access for those in their diversity to fully engage themselves. So going beyond just being present, what are we doing to actively empower and encourage belonging and inclusion for those that are at the table? Moving forward, we have the term performative that I know I've already used at the beginning of this presentation. So to give a little bit further context here, That is an adjective in this case. It is typically used to describe social justice efforts that are perceived as having more of a focus on appearance, company branding, and checking the box than outcomes and transformative change. And so when a social issue is present at the table, the work that's being done isn't necessarily addressing it or encouraging dismantlement of what that inequity is, but kind of that vanity, surface level check the box that's more meant for optics than for changing the system. And finally, the term historically excluded groups is one that's going to come up a few times in this presentation. So I just want to clarify here what I mean. I'm using the term historically excluded groups to replace the term minority. I think that minority has a very negative connotation when it refers to especially groups of people, BIPOC, Black people, LGBTQIA+, people who are differently able, who have been intentionally excluded from systems of decision-making, policy in society. So by calling it historically excluded groups instead of minority, we're calling it what it is. We're being more intentional in addressing the problem at hand. So that term is referring to any group of people that has been historically disenfranchised or excluded from full rights, privileges, and opportunities in a society or organization. And I just want to put all of these definitions on the table again to give you some context in what I am referring to as I use these throughout the presentation. Again, if anybody has any questions, if you need any clarification along the way, please let me know. But first, we need to clarify what tokenism is. Before we can start talking about what it means to go beyond it, what does tokenism mean to you? And this is where I want to encourage everybody to start using the chat a little bit more. When tokenism is used as a phrase, when you hear that somebody is being tokenized, tokenization, token gestures, what does that mean? What comes to mind? Maybe it might be a feeling, might be an example. What does that look like to you? And there's no wrong answer here. I just want to get everybody's thoughts and opinions on this before going into my official definitions of it. So it could be a prize, checking the box when it comes to doing the work. It feels performative. I see that twice now. A performative gesture that's not really making much change. Being the only minority, the only member of a historically excluded group in a space, the acceptable person of color, for example, LGBTQ+ person, thinking that one can represent their entire race, having a person represent an entire group of people, viewing them as the quote unquote representation, attempting to include, but actually cherry picking to meet numbers. Meeting quotas is definitely something we're about to talk about today. Hiring a small number of people, specifically Black people in this example, at low-level positions to show you're diverse, but not going up in diversity as you ascend to the board level, for example, executive leadership, a symbolic effort. Yes, absolutely. So I think you all could probably leave this presentation, but I will get into my notes moving forward from this one, but please feel free to keep going from here. So just being one, it's not real inclusive diversity, but rather that check the box measure. Great. So absolutely. One definition of tokenism is that it's presence without meaningful participation. You have somebody in the room to say that they're there, but not giving them much of an opportunity to engage themselves, to engage their full skill set, to meaningfully participate. It is the exploitations of someone's identity in order to check a diversity box. We're going to talk a lot about quotas today, but exploiting somebody that might be a member of a historically excluded group, for example, to define them by that identity when they enter the room, to not see the wide array and diverse array of skill sets that they bring to the table when they're there, but really zeroing in on that demographic identity. And then the official definition of tokenism that I've included here is the practice of making only a perfunctory or symbolic effort to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of people from historically excluded groups in order to give the appearance of equality within a workforce. And underneath this definition, I really want us to think racial equality, ethnicity, gender, ability status, sexual orientation, any person that is a member of a historically excluded group that's being recruited into a place or being exploited in a photo op, for example, without really making real change, really leaving it at the symbolic effort. This is what we're thinking when we think tokenism, in addition to everything that has been put in the chat thus far. a few examples of tokenism, and these are real examples that I have quoted with individuals' permission from when I wrote my thesis, from when I have done this DEI work in the corporate world. The list goes on, but these are real examples, and they're just a few. So, yep.
Natalia, there's a good comment in the chat I just want to bring to your attention. It says that tokenism can lead to imposter syndrome, stress, and further discrimination. Even when there's more than one woman or one person of color in a company's leadership, if they don't have any real power, then that's where tokenism as well.
Absolutely. So in a lot of ways, tokenism has that symbolic representation where you're not giving the power, the decision-making ability that comes with being in an executive role, for example. And we're going to get into a little bit more the harm and implications of token gestures on those historically excluded employees, on those tokenized employees. So that is a great point. Thank you. So a few examples. This first one, I'm a mid-level manager at my company and also happen to be the only gay employee who is out at work. Whenever we meet with clients who are openly LGBTQIA+, my bosses make sure that I'm always in the room. Behind the scenes, I'm not included on any projects related to said clients, and all of my ideas are shot down. So in this example, we're seeing a clear-cut case of tokenism where the employee who is a member of a historically excluded group as being a gay employee is being used for optics purely. They're being used to send a message that this workplace is promoting equality and making sure that there's equity and representation. But when it comes to actual engagement, when it comes to being able to use their skill set to further the agency's mission, when it comes to being able to support that client that they're being put in front of, they're not getting that opportunity. So it's presence without meaningful participation. The next one, BIPOC employees being assigned race-related tasks and engaged in a suspicious number of photo ops. So whenever there's an opportunity for external promotion, social media posts, the employees are being featured there, but there's a lack of mobility or opportunity to take part in other work that engages their skill set. So in this case, they're really being zeroed in on for the optics, for that demographic identity that can be used as external representation, but they're not moving up in the company. They're not being given meaningful opportunities for engagement. Another example, again, a real life example. I am the only Black woman in my department of roughly 25 employees. This year, my boss came to me and asked if I could take the lead on planning Black History Month. I felt uncomfortable, but I said sure and sent out multiple invitations for my coworkers to collaborate. Not one reply or offer to help. So in this case, once again, we're seeing the exploitation of somebody's identity where they might be a great planner. They might know a lot about Black History Month, but as the only Black woman in a department of a significant number of employees, to be asked to single-handedly plan an event and to not receive any offers of help or offers of collaboration, first, it sends a message that Black History Month really is not that important or significant to that company, that department. And it's also singling out and tokenizing the only Black woman in the department for asking her to single-handedly plan it without giving the resources, the time, the people to do the work right. And the last example that we have here is one woman being added to an all male identified leadership team that's making little to no effort to continue diversifying or build a more inclusive culture. So it's still laden with microaggressions. The bias, whether implicit or explicit, is still very much at the table. And this woman is being used as the diversity without making sure that she feels included, empowered, that she belongs, or creating more opportunities to continue diversifying in terms of the gender spectrum in this case. Does anybody have any questions so far? Anything that's coming up for them? Any examples that they would like to share? And I can't fully see the chat right now, so I'm relying on Karen for that one.
You're good.
Okay, sounds good. And again, if anything comes up for you along the way, please feel free to put it in the chat. At the end of the day, tokenism is a band-aid solution to a systemic problem. It is not getting to the root of the inequity that has made it so that we have to tokenize or single-handedly put one person into a position of leadership, for example, to give that appearance of diversity. It's not getting to the root of the problem. It is isolating the token individual, the individuals who are being tokenized, and increasing focus on that person's access, putting them under a microscope, that in a way is making them out to be the representative. I know that somebody put in the chat previously, the representation of their race, of their ethnicity, of their gender identity, their sexual orientation, that demographic identity that's being tokenized in this instance. It can lead, as we said before, to imposter syndrome, where somebody feels that they are not actually meant to be in this place, that they're being really exploited for their demographic identity and that their skill set isn't there, when that is most likely absolutely not the case. But when they're only being seen for their demographics and not engaged for the rest of their skill set, that is where imposter syndrome can come into play. It can lead to stress, feelings of isolation, accelerated burnout, and high turnover. So this can cause significant harm for those employees that are being tokenized. As we said before, token gestures, tokenism, is neither addressing nor resolving the historical and systemic factors that have preserved demographically homogeneous spaces. So spaces where we are seeing a high percentage of one form of identity. It's not addressing the barriers to access and positions of power, decision-making, executive leadership, because as we know, when we start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we start talking about anti-racism and historical inequity, the system was designed to be this way. The system is functioning exactly as it was intended to. So when we don't address the roots of that system that has led to this inequity, that have led to the disparities in representation and places of decision-making and who has a seat at the table, we're not doing much to bring about long-term sustainable change. We really just have a Band-Aid solution and a check the box measure here. And finally, tokenism is prioritizing image and diversity quotas over introspection and transformative, meaningful change. So as we said about 100 times at this point, it's not encouraging anybody to look within and say, what is up with our company that we have historical inequities embedded in our foundations? What do we need to do to make sure that there's long-term change and we don't need quotas, but that we're naturally bringing people in and giving them a place at the table without having to make these token gestures. And here I have an activity, I've called it fact check. So I'm going to have a series of 3 statements. And for each statement that shows up, I'm going to ask, is it a myth? Is it a reality? Or is it somewhere in between? And then there will be a poll that comes up that corresponds with what that statement was. You can indicate your response there, and then we'll go from there. So fact check number 1, the fact of being the only, insert identity here, within the workplace, on a board, et cetera, automatically amounts to tokenism. So that could be the only Black woman, the only lesbian employee, the only disabled employee. Being the only one automatically amounts to tokenism. And I'll give it about 15 seconds to make sure that we have everyone's response come in. All right. If you haven't answered yet, I'll give it about 5 more seconds. And if we could have the poll results show up. Okay. Thank you. So we have 24% saying that this is a fact, 54% saying that this is a myth, and 22% saying that they're unsure about this. So let's dive in a little bit further here. This is indeed, if I could do a drum roll, I absolutely would, but I can't, and I can't make myself do the sound effect. So it's a myth. The fact of being the only insert identity here within the workplace, on a board, automatically amounts to tokenism. This is not the case. Making that assumption can be unfair. It can be reductive to the skill set of the person at the table, and it can be harmful to those that are holding these spaces, those that are the only one in the room. When we think about tokenism, what determines it, what determines tokenization, depends more on why and how somebody is occupying the space. So for example, questions that we can ask to determine the difference. Is the individual actively valued and recognized for all that they bring to the table? Is their skill set being seen, their perspective, their ideas, their lived experience beyond their demographic identity? Are those things being valued and recognized? Or are they really being zeroed in on just for that? Are they being engaged, for example, only when it comes to race and culture related tasks and events? Or are they being seen for their full skill set when they do the work, when they come to work each day? Is the individual being compensated fairly? So when we saw the example previously where somebody is being single-handedly asked to plan Black History Month in addition to the work that they're already doing, while that was an example of tokenism, if the individual is not being compensated, for example, if they're not being rewarded for that additional labor that they're bringing to the table to do that extra work, to bring their lived experience out, that could determine tokenism as well. Another piece here is, do they hold a position that warrants the amount of labor they're being asked to perform? Is somebody being exploited, being brought into spaces that are above their pay grade without being compensated to do that extra work, without being recognized or rewarded for it, without seeing much internal talent mobility within the organization? And is that organization that might only have one Asian employee, for example, in the entire department, are they actively working to continue diversifying, to actively mitigate bias and inequity and recruitment and barriers to access? Are they looking within and being introspective and saying, okay, we need to do better, we will continue to do better, and this is what we're actively doing to continue diversifying in an intentional way to ensure sustainability? Or are they just leaving it as, oh, we have one Asian employee, that's significant, we don't need to do much more than that, the optics look great? Because this shouldn't be about optics. And when it purely is that, when it's purely about meeting quota and not needing to do any work beyond that, that's when we remain in the realm of tokenism. All right, fact check number 2. Tokenism is harmful not only to... Oops.
I'm sorry, I was on mute so you couldn't hear me. You have a comment I want to share with you. It says, I'd like to go to intent, and it's often well-meaning. However, the reality is if the individual is very successful, it's one and done. It's a lot of pressure. Your failures, conversely, can oftentimes lead to negativity of seldom, if ever, hiring others. The one and done mentality isn't the answer.
Absolutely. And that also goes back into when an individual is being seen as the representation, the representative, where they're being put on this pedestal and a platform to have to do everything right all of the time. Because if they don't, then moving forward, oh, we tried it. We tried to diversify, but it didn't work out. That is reductive, it is harmful, it is stereotyping, and it is not going to take us anywhere in the future. It won't encourage sustainable change. And it's a ton of pressure and stress on that employee that's being tokenized. So that's a great point. Thank you, Karen. All right, so fact check number 2. Tokenism is harmful not only to individuals, but also to organizations' DEI efforts. And so we are going to launch a poll now that says whether you think that this is a fact, a myth, or unsure. And if we want to give it about 15 seconds for everyone to get their response in, and then we can show their answers. I feel like I could hum the Jeopardy theme song, but I don't think anyone would appreciate that. So I'll just leave it here. So tokenism is harmful not only to individuals, but also to organizations' DEI efforts. We can close out the poll and show the responses here. All right, so we have 98% saying that this is a fact, 2% saying that they're unsure. This is indeed a fact. Tokenism is harmful not only to individuals, but also to organizations' DEI efforts. And I should say here to organizations more broadly, this doesn't just have to do with a single initiative, but really who the organization is, their values, and what they're doing in terms of their service delivery, in terms of the product that they're providing. So token gestures often translates, as we said before, to these performative efforts to be more inclusive in a way that doesn't carry authentic impact or encourage sustainability. All of the effort that somebody might be coming in to put into a check the box approach is not going to last in the long term. It can lead to harm to employees, whether those that are being tokenized or those that are on the receiving end more broadly. It can lead to lack of trust from your stakeholders, both internally and externally, particularly those who identify as members of historically excluded groups, those who are being tokenized or are seeing tokenization readily happening at the executive leadership level, for example, at the board level. It's not sending a message that the organization is really about it when it comes to the work, but rather is more about checking the box in order to center the optics over transformative, meaningful change. Leads to high employee turnover, which for a variety of reasons can be extremely harmful, and wasted time and resources. And so when we are investing all of this effort, time, energy, money even into token gestures, into tokenization, this is not going to take us anywhere in the long term. We're wasting time, we're wasting resources, and we need to find a more sustainable way. So that is indeed a fact. And finally, last one here, having a demographically diverse workforce is enough to make an organization inclusive. So again, indicate whether you think that that is a fact, a myth, or you're unsure. Give it about 10 seconds and we'll load the results. So having a demographically diverse workforce, having diversity is enough to make an organization inclusive. All right, we have 4% saying that this is a fact, 95% saying that this is a myth, and 2% saying that they're unsure about this. Let's check it out. This is a myth. Having a demographically diverse workforce is not enough to make an organization inclusive. A phrase that I hear quite often is that diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being invited to dance. And so while you can't have inclusion without diversity, you can't dance if you're not being invited to the party, you can absolutely have diversity without inclusion. And so when we're determining whether an organization that's demographically diverse is inclusive in nature, there are a few factors to consider here. So for example, is the diversity that we're seeing concentrated or is it widespread? So that means is the diversity concentrated within certain departments, roles, or levels of the organization? A lot of the times you'll see this more, the direct service roles, the lower wage roles, the roles that don't have much opportunity to ascend in the organization. Is that where all of the quote unquote diversity that you're seeing, whether that be racial diversity, gender diversity, sexual orientation diversity, is it concentrated at the lower level of the organization? And as you move up, does the diversity dwindle? When we get to the executive leadership positions, when you get to the board level, are you still seeing that same amount of demographic diversity in these spaces, or is it really concentrated at the bottom? And in that case, we're not seeing inclusion. We're seeing surface level diversity that's not doing the real work to diversify in the positions of decision-making, those positions of power. Assimilation versus belonging is another factor to consider here. So are these quote unquote racially diverse employees, for example, are they expected to code switch and to fit into dominant culture norms? Are they allowed to show up to work as their full authentic selves, or do they have to fit into the quote unquote way that things have always been? Are they allowed to be their full selves? Are they empowered? Are they given a sense of belonging when they come to work? Or do they have to assimilate so that they can keep their jobs, so that they can feel respected, so that they continue to have that seat at the table? DEI metrics and outcomes is another factor that we want to consider here too. So it's not enough to just say we have demographic diversity. Once we start disaggregating that diversity, are we seeing demographic disparities in turnover, for example, and our retention rates and our internal talent mobility? So yeah, we might have diversity, but who's moving up within the organization? Who is leaving? Who's being fired? Who doesn't feel like they belong here? How can we use metrics and outcomes to really get a little bit more specific there and understanding what does this look like? What are the outcomes for those that are quote unquote diverse within this organization? And I do want to point out that everybody is diverse. So let's say more specifically, maybe racially diverse employees that are members of historically excluded groups. And then the last point here is accountability. So it's not enough just to try to diversify, to try to bring people in to increase that demographic representation. But are there individuals that are causing harm within the workplace to individuals that are members of historically excluded groups? Are there harmful cultural norms and values or policies even that are continuing to perpetuate harm and really decreasing the retention of employees that are members of historically excluded groups after they come in? And that's why recruitment and retention have to go hand in hand. And also, are there efforts to promote cultural humility within the workforce? So again, it's not enough just to have somebody come in and expect them to assimilate. Are there opportunities for the entire workforce to grow in their cultural humility, to grow in their interpersonal dynamics, community building, all of the above? So these are just a few factors to consider to switch from simply having demographic diversity to having inclusive diversity. And we'll be talking about that more in a second. So at the end of the day, we need to start prioritizing impact over percentages. Those token gestures are really leading into meeting quotas, needing to hit a certain percentage to say, look, we did it. We have it, we have them, we can point to them, they're here. But that is not going to take us anywhere in the long term. That's not going to be sustainable. Hiring to meet a diversity quota can put you on a fast track to tokenism and the harm that comes with it. So as we discussed before, that imposter syndrome, the stress, the burnout, the distrust of the agency, the fragmented team dynamics, the turnover. Diversity quotas can only take us so far. And meeting a quota does not guarantee that you're meeting individuals' needs. When we only focus on percentage and we don't think about impact, what is the experience of the employee that's coming into a generally demographically homogeneous workforce? Are their needs being met? Is the culture being improved to become more hospitable, to become empowering, to promote an environment of belonging? And meeting a quota does not address historical inequity. It's kind of a Band-Aid solution that doesn't make us get introspective and look and say, historically, what has our organization done to perpetuate inequity? What has our organization done to create barriers to access at the leadership level, at the board level? And what can we do to rectify that so that moving forward, we don't need to rely on token gestures in order to diversify. We can do that naturally because we're creating a more inclusive environment, externally and internally. And we'll go into that more in a second. Transformative change, which is really what we're looking for here when it comes to DEI, when it comes to anti-racism, it requires intentional investment and systems level disruption. These check the box measures, the Band-Aid solutions are not going to take us anywhere, because when you only check the box and you don't consider the root of the problem, all of the other factors that are going into the situation at hand, we cannot rectify that. We can't mitigate the bias and inequity in order to move forward, do better, and encourage sustainability. What I advocate here in order to shift from those quotas, in order to have sustainable change, is that we shift from tokenism to inclusive diversity. I included a quote here from America Ferrera in the Huffington Post. So America Ferrera is an actress, and this quote is very much grounded in the realm of acting and in casting. But I think that it can be a beautiful metaphor as well, just for the work that we're doing within our organizations. So the quote says, tokenism is about inserting—
Would you like to drink some ice water? Coffee?
Tokenism is about inserting diverse characters.
You want half, the other half?
Is there a way to—
How about a sandwich first? I have some chicken.
Can everyone make sure they're on mute? We're hearing a little bit of conversation.
We're good to go.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Tokenism is about inserting diverse characters because you feel you have to, whereas true diversity means writing characters that aren't just defined by the color of their skin and casting the right actor for the role. So this has nothing to do with decreasing in the quality of candidates, but it does mean going beyond diversification as a check the box measure. And really because you know that this brings value to the organization, that you know that individuals with diverse lived experiences, backgrounds, and skill sets can only get us to do better as organizations, can only help us to improve and move forward as a society. So organizations that embrace inclusive diversity recognize the significance of having widespread demographic diversity, not just as a check the box measure, but as something that can help increase the quality of our programs, increase the quality of the products that we're able to provide our client interactions. It doesn't look to individuals as the representation or as the spokesperson for their identity. Inclusive diversity sees individuals for their full selves, their skill sets, and their qualifications. So again, not defining somebody by the color of their skin, for example, or by their sexual orientation, but understanding that is just one part of who they are, in addition to all of the other skills and qualifications and lived experiences that they're bringing to the table. It provides meaningful opportunities for every voice and perspective to be heard. So again, going beyond having an exploitative approach, or having somebody in the room for the sake of saying that they're there, and creating opportunities for their voice to be centered, eliciting feedback, and ensuring that when they're in that room, they have a space there where they belong, not to just check a box. It is making an active effort to cultivate cultural competence and humility. And I really don't like leaving it at cultural competence, which is why I've included cultural humility here. Because again, it's not enough to bring in a diverse array of characters or individuals into a workplace, for example. What are we doing to not be colorblind, but rather to be anti-racist? What are we doing to ensure that we are cognizant and empowering of the diverse array of identities, needs, and lived experiences that come to the table? Because that's a shift from equality to equity, which is what we need to do to rectify those historical inequities and move forward. Inclusive diversity, an organization that's embracing it, is committing space and time for ongoing community building. So we don't work in a vacuum. When we come to work each day, especially after the 514 shooting, we can't just go on business as usual, as if nothing has happened, that we just have work to do. How are we creating opportunities for connection? How are we creating opportunities to check in with each other and understand perspective, lived experiences, areas of need that go beyond the immediate work task that's at hand? How are we committing space and time for community building so that we understand each other and develop those interpersonal dynamics at work? Embracing inclusive diversity also means identifying and mitigating bias and systemic inequities. So again, it's not enough to just bring in a quota and say, we're going to meet this and we're going to be done and we don't have to do any work further from here. This is about identifying biases, identifying systemic inequities and mitigating them, dismantling them so that moving forward, we're in a better place overall. Not having to rely on check the box measures in order to see more diversity within the workplace, but naturally being able to do that because we've done the work to get introspective and challenge the system as it has historically been. And inclusive diversity transcends quotas and leaves behind check the box approaches. So rather than saying this is enough, we can just put a photo op here, we can make sure that our social media is quote unquote diverse in representation. How can we go beyond quotas to really get to the real systems level change that we need? So inclusive diversity is also about zeroing out and not looking at somebody simply for their sexual orientation, for example, for their racial identity, but understanding that in our existences as humans, we're intersectional. We have so many different demographic identities, personal identities, perspectives, passions that we bring to the table. And when we only view somebody for the one demographic identity that we think will meet a quota for us, we're doing ourselves a disservice as employers, as coworkers, for not seeing the diverse skill set and the wide array of contributions that they're bringing to the table. I see it.
I'm going to hold your questions to the end, Natalia. Okay. And then I have a whole list for you.
Okay, thank you. All right. So where do we go from here? That was a lot of information about where some of us might be right now, what the shift might look like, but what does it look like to make that shift? And something that I want to emphasize before getting into that is that this work is subjective. There's not going to be a one size fits all approach for shifting to inclusive diversity, for working towards diversity, equity, inclusion in your organization, because we are all so unique and our context is different in terms of What are the needs of our clients? What is the work that we're doing? If this was a one size fits all approach, if we could just check the box and say, if we all do this, we'll be great, we'd be in a much better place as a society. We'd be in a much different place as a society. So before going into this, I just want to emphasize that again, that this will vary per organization, but these are just some general questions that I want to put on the table. So step one, articulating the why for inclusive diversity. I hear a lot across the board, organizations, boards saying, we want to be more diverse. We need more diversity. We're all demographically homogenous. We're all white, for example. But what does it really mean to say we want to be more diverse? What does that outcome look like, and why does diversity matter? And I mean that in the sense of beyond a quota. This isn't just about statistics and reporting out for grant funding. What is the power of having broad demographic diversity, diversity of lived experience at the table? And if that means taking a step back and needing to figure out how to articulate that, and articulate that at the very top, all throughout the organization, that's where some of us might need to start. Why does this even matter to begin with? Step two, identifying and addressing the obstacles to inclusive diversity at work. So as we said before, you can absolutely have diversity without inclusion. In a lot of ways, that's where that tokenism is feeding into. So questions to ask is, when it comes to building an inclusive culture, what might be our current shortcomings? What can we do to overcome them? And this is really going to require a high level of honesty and transparency, because the quote that I love from James Baldwin that I've included at the end of this presentation is that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So if we're not willing to call it as it is and really get honest and introspective about where we are right now as an organization, we can only do so much to change things and move forward. Step three is shifting from checklist to policy change. So this is transcending those quotas to get to the root of the historical inequities that we're navigating within our organizations. A question to ask is, if we have a demographically homogeneous workforce, what are the factors that have historically impacted our ability to consistently recruit or maintain members of historically excluded groups? There is a reason why our workforces in a lot of places look demographically homogenous. And a major microaggression that I hear constantly is that, well, there just aren't any qualified people, or Black people don't become social workers. And that is absolutely not the case. And so what are the historical factors that have made it so that there are barriers to access within our organizations? What do our recruitment schemes look like? Where are we recruiting from? What do our internal cultures look like that might be impacting our ability to recruit or retain members of historically excluded groups? Again, where are we recruiting from? Well, how can we do better on our end to make our jobs more visible and appealing to an increasingly diverse candidate pool, so that we don't have to rely on token gestures, but that people see us as a place to work naturally? How can we make our employee policies more inclusive for individuals whose needs and experiences diverge from those of the dominant culture? So again, just because things have functioned like this previously, and just because things have worked this way, does not mean that that works for everyone. In a lot of ways, the policies that we have in place currently might be meeting the needs of demographically homogenous groups, people that are members of dominant culture. But if we want to move to a culture of inclusive diversity, we have to make changes. We have to get introspective and say, okay, are these policies meeting the needs of everyone? Or do we need to, for example, build in a floating holiday to make sure that individuals that have different cultural observances, different holiday observances, are able to take off without their PTO being extremely impacted because of it? And by doing this, in addition to reducing the number of token gestures that we have, this will make sure that we see more sustainability in the DEI work that we're doing. Another point that I've included here is that we need to start measuring impact over percentages. So when we only operate with a quota-driven mindset, that often leads to diversity without inclusion. If we can extend our data analysis beyond just saying, this is what our demographic representation looks like in our workforce, but really breaking it down further to consider, do employees with historically excluded identities have sway in decisions, discussions, or the power to lead projects? Are they in influential roles? Because again, it's not enough to just have somebody in the room. What are we doing to empower them in their identity? What are we doing to make sure that their full skill set is coming out and being used in the day-to-day to move our organizations further? And are they in influential roles? Do they have decision-making power? Can they influence policy? or is this simply a symbolic measure? Another question to ask is, what do internal employee engagement and talent mobility look like? So this will start looking more at impact over the percentages. If you see disparities in turnover, if you see disparities in internal mobility on account of different racial identities, for example, gender identities, sexual orientations, that's something that we need to zero in on and figure out, what do we need to change on our end? Because having diversity is not enough. What is the experience of employees when they come to our workplace? Internal audits is another way to measure impact over percentages. So leveraging surveys, leveraging focus groups, ways to elicit employee feedback, the feedback of your clients, in order to get their direct feedback about what the organization is doing in terms of inclusion, in terms of equity, in terms of belonging, and giving your employees, your stakeholders, a direct platform to express areas of need. That is a great way to transcend that quantitative demographic representation and understand what the experiences are of those that are in your workforce in the day-to-day. And finally, when you have DEI strategy, when you have DEI initiatives, are you attaching meaningful metrics and outcomes to the work that you're doing? Because we can plan Black History Month, we can put out a post about Pride and Juneteenth, but what is changing within our organizations on account of that? So are there ways to track what the outcomes have been of the measures that we have in place currently? I've included here just briefly a screenshot of a metrics inventory that I've linked at the end of this presentation that I think is a great way to transcend that quick bullet point about diversity and representation, because this really breaks down within context and within the initiatives that we have for DEI at our organizations, what the metrics might look like to track the success of them. So just as an added resource from that last point that I just made about measuring impact, Gartner's DEI metrics inventory is a great resource. And step 5 is to keep the work going. So transformative change, as we said before, is not a one-size-fits-all approach. The experience that we have, the areas of need that we have are going to vary per our organizations, just based on the areas of need, based on the context of the work that we're doing. We need to leave behind expectations of instant gratification. This is not a field that you get into because you want to see the whole system change tomorrow. This is something that is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in the making. So we have to understand, as Melissa Donaldson said previously, that this work is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Those check the box approaches are not going to get us anywhere. And finally, embracing sustainability and centering the voices of your stakeholders. Those are being directly impacted by the work. Those that are not quotas, that are not numbers, but that are people that are humans with real lived experiences that can provide incredibly valuable feedback so that we can do this work right and transcend those token measures. And as promised, I did leave a quote here from James Baldwin that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing that is can be changed until it is faced. So again, with tokenism, with transcending quotas, in order to get to the real root of the problem, we have to name the issue at hand. When we rely on check the box approaches, when we rely on band-aid solutions rather than tending to the wound, we will remain in the same place until we become intentional and call the problem as it is. And so that is the main content for me right now. And I do want to leave some time for questions from everyone, but I also wanted to leave you all with resources as well. So for further reading, I have listed The Diversity Gap by Bethany Wilkinson as a great resource to understand the difference between intent versus impact when it comes to DEI efforts, when it comes to cultural change. The Pink Elephant newsletter is also a great resource for ongoing learning, where you can get bi-weekly to monthly updates about DEI efforts to create more inclusive and empowering environments. And I have also linked here Gartner's DEI metrics inventory, that resource that I shared previously that goes beyond basic bullet points about demographic representation and expands our metrics tracking around DEI. And so that is it for me for now. I want to leave some time here, as mentioned, for any questions, any thoughts, or maybe any ideas about what you want to take back to your organizations on account of this information here.
First, I'll say thank you, Natalia. I enjoyed that presentation. We will put your resources on our website, that sheet that you have of your resources, so everybody can have access to them in case you didn't get to write everything down. I do have a couple questions for you, and we'll start with the one you probably can see on the screen. It says, how can I balance not making someone feel like they're a spokesperson, but also wanting input that perhaps only they can bring to the table? I want and value others' input, but don't want anyone to feel I tokenize them by asking for their opinion, help, or input. I hope that my team members know me to be someone who thinks thoughtfully, but I do worry / feel. I do PR and marketing. And someone flipped the screen, so that was gone. I do PR and marketing for my company for background.
Yeah, I think that it is incredibly important to make sure that we have a diverse array of voices at the table. So this isn't to imply that we don't bring in different perspectives. We don't ask somebody that has that direct lived experience about what their stance is, but we want to make sure that we are seeing them for their full selves. That also might mean acknowledging, look, I don't have this perspective. And I know that based on what you've shared with me previously, if you're comfortable, would you mind maybe assisting me with this? But also that comes with compensation. So we don't want unpaid labor here. If that is not within somebody's job description, if this is going to be in addition to their workload, how are you acknowledging that? How are you ensuring that there is equity there where you are not asking other employees potentially for them to put that extra labor in? So I think that it's incredibly important to acknowledge that we need to make sure we have diversity at the table. The racial equity impact analysis training through the Community Foundation is great at emphasizing that when we make decisions, when we plan events even, who is in the room to do that? Who are we giving power to? But are we making sure that the power is meaningful, that their participation is meaningful and not just something that is seen as exploitative because we need to check a box there? Does that make sense?
All right, I have another question. This is interesting. In the interview process, how can I tell if I'm being hired as a token? Wow.
That's a great question. I think that maybe you could call it as it is and say, based on my skill set, what is it that you see that I can bring to your organization? So, that same question that they might ask you is, what do you think you can bring to this role? What can I bring to you? And that will put them on the spot in the moment to either acknowledge your skill set for what it is, acknowledge the resume and all of the experiences that you've just named. But if they stumble and say, and they can't acknowledge that diversity of your identity and they're stuck at the demographic representation, it might be time to move on for that position.
And also I would recommend asking for their data, asking for their data.
And I think that that's a great point too, their data, and even asking about their DEI efforts. What is the organization doing? If you're able to do some research in advance about their demographic representation, a lot of that data is transparent and accessible at this point. Ask them, I noticed this as a statistic. Can you tell me a little bit more about what your organization is doing to address that, what your DEI efforts might look like? And that will put them on the spot as well.
All right, and also someone said, I love the mention of code switching. Can you talk a little bit about more what that means?
Yes. So code switching is kind of the concept where, depending on which space you're occupying, what group of people you're around, needing to change your personality, change your mannerisms, your gestures in order to assimilate or belong in that space that you're in. So for example, if somebody is around a group of friends, the personality that might be coming out, the different words that they're using, phrases, what they're willing to share, is not likely to be the same as when they're around their bosses, for example, or when they are in a board meeting. And so where code switching can become harmful, because of course there's a certain degree of professionalism that we have to switch to, the phrases that we use, slang even. Where it can be harmful is that members of historically excluded groups are often the ones that are pushed to assimilate even further, where they have to leave their authentic self at the door in order to feel as though they can belong in the spaces of decision-making, for example, or executive leadership. And so switching who you are in order to meet the needs of that room or assimilate into that culture.
Yeah. Awesome. Can you talk a little bit more about the trauma of being the token? And a further comment says, I feel that I'm a token, and when I make a mistake, it gets magnified into something that it really doesn't need to be. So can you speak to that?
Right. So as somebody who has also been the resident token, unfortunately, I can say that you're made out to be the representation, you're the representative. And so if everyone is looking at you to be the spokesperson, or you're defining an entire group of people in a stereotypical way, that puts, not only is that harmful and ignorant, but that puts an incredible amount of pressure on the person that has to be the representative. That means that there's no opportunities to slip up. You're not allowed to make mistakes, because when you make those mistakes, you're being seen as reflective of a broader group of people that you've never even met before, simply because of your demographic identity. Another example is that I have heard organizations, unfortunately, post the mass shooting, looking at their Black employees, for example, as leading the crisis response, because they feel, oh, you have that lived experience. We're white, we don't know. But what if somebody is mourning? What if somebody doesn't even think they can come to work today, let alone be there to support others? And so when that pressure of tokenism is put on them to have to take the charge and their needs aren't being met, that can cause an incredible amount of harm that might just lead to turnover.
Okay, great. Can you give advice on how to inform your employee that they are doing performative acts?
I think that we talked before about that need to get introspective. So you don't necessarily have to say, this is performative, nobody likes this. You could say that if you're comfortable doing so, but maybe suggesting, okay, I don't know if this is having the impact that we want it to be having on the issue at hand. Maybe we could take a step back and bring more people to the table to think about what kind of strategy, what do we want to accomplish here? What would the strategy look like to accomplish it? And how do we know that we're making real change? Or if the initiative is already being rolled out, how are we tracking what the impact is? Because again, there's a difference between intent versus impact. So if you're able to bring more accountability to whatever the measure is and say, okay, who's in the space to make this decision? Who's in the planning process? And could we do a little bit better here?
Another question, can you talk a little bit more about the racial equity training that you mentioned before?
Absolutely. So the Community Foundation of Greater Buffalo, partnered with the Race Matters Institute, offers a racial equity impact analysis training that I am personally a coach for. And so what the model is that your organization up to, I believe, let me not give numbers, I'm not good at that part, but your organization, a certain team, can go in and understand more in a local context the historical inequities within the region, within Western New York specifically. And then the tool is a resource to, when it comes to decision making, when it comes to policy, when it comes to hiring even, how can we embed a racial equity lens? So for example, who is at the table when we make decisions? Who will be impacted by this policy? Are they at the table to be able to give their input and perspective? And I think that it's just a great resource if your team needs a little bit more of a background in what racial inequity looks like in the context of Western New York, and then how we can do better at our organization. So I would look into the Community Foundation's Racial Equity Impact Analysis training if you'd like to learn more.
Let me unmute. You have a few more questions. It says earlier in the presentation, you talked about making sure companies get away from, oh, these people don't go into this career. What are good spaces to go locally to meaningfully recruit more than white male doctors specifically? This is something we know needs to change or be addressed. Right now, meaningful action we're taking is trying to reach people while they're still in school. So can you speak to where recruitment can be done to increase minority representation?
So I cannot confidently recommend any recruitment sources for doctors specifically, but I can say that idea of tapping into resource groups, for example. So within universities, within colleges, there are often different associations. I can think of NSBE, for example, for Black engineers. So looking at those specific affinity spaces that are formed around members of historically excluded groups could be a great place to start to try to tap into access there, or creating more opportunities to go beyond that demographically homogenous crowd that we typically see. But even in the community, there are so many different organizations. I know that I'm even in a few DEI affinity spaces for practitioners that identify as people of color. So trying to maybe use your network to figure out what is available locally, maybe outside of higher education, that you could partner with or tap into or reach out to with your employment opportunities.
And you have another question. How can we be better allies for moments of tokenship when we see occur on a daily basis? Any best practices?
Silence is complicity. So the first thing that we could start doing is to speak up, especially if we see it happening. That doesn't mean making it uncomfortable for the person that you perceive as being tokenized, but maybe reaching out to the person that is supervising them, the person that is perpetuating those token gestures, the tokenism, and say, hey, I know that X and X person has this skill set in finance. I really think we could bring them in on this project to make sure that we are operationalizing what they can bring to the table. So without calling it, oh, you know, they're the only Black employee and you're making them plan Black History Month and not having them do anything else, which might be the case. How can you provide opportunities for them to become more included? Do you have a platform that you can use your power to bring them into these spaces too? That's another form of allyship, is using your power to empower others.
Okay, here's an interesting one. What can I do because I feel like a token? How do I get my boss to understand? Wow.
I think, yeah, and I know that we're about done now, so let me keep this short and simple. As we just said before, flipping that script and saying, you know, I have this skill set and I would really like to be involved in this project because I think that my finance background, I do not have a finance background. I don't know why I keep using that example, but using my finance background, I think that we could really improve this project if I were in on it. Do you think that that could be an opportunity? So maybe trying to bring yourself into the room. Shirley Chisholm says, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. So if you can find opportunities to get yourself in these spaces where your skill set is being operationalized, I think that that is a great place to start.
All right, thank you, Natalia, for your presentation. You were right. We went right down to the exact minute. We will have her, the recordings for the presentations will be up on the Buffalo Niagara Partnership website probably in about a week because they all have to be compressed and put them in a format that we can work with them. So our presentation will be up there. We'll make sure we have her resources. And with that, we're going to have everybody get ready to go over the session too. Thank you, Natalia. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.